"That dress looks like it belongs in a thrift store," the billionaire said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, and the room fell into the kind of silence that only comes when people are waiting to see someone get embarrassed. I was carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses when I heard the comment. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then a few nervous laughs drifted through the dining room, and I realized every eye was on me. I looked down at the navy blue dress I was wearing. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't expensive. It was simple, clean, and several years old. I had worn it because it was comfortable during long shifts. Slowly, I lifted my eyes toward the man who had spoken. Richard Harrington. One of the most recognizable businessmen in New York. His face appeared regularly in magazines, financial news programs, and charity galas. He was seated at the best table in the restaurant, surrounded by investors, executives, and people who seemed eager to laugh whenever he did. I expected to feel angry. Instead, I smiled. Not because the remark didn't hurt, but because I had learned a long time ago that people reveal far more about themselves than they ever reveal about you. "Would you like more water, sir?" I asked calmly. The smile on his face tightened slightly. Perhaps he had expected me to argue. Perhaps he wanted a scene. Instead, I simply refilled the glass and continued serving the table. The conversation resumed around him, but something had changed. I could feel his eyes following me as I moved through the dining room. The restaurant sat on the edge of Central Park, a place where executives closed million-dollar deals over dinner and tourists celebrated special occasions. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished wood floors. Outside, the city glowed beneath the evening sky. Inside, every table was filled. To most people, I was invisible. Just another waitress moving quietly between conversations that seemed more important than her own life. And that was exactly how I preferred it. An hour later, Richard called me back to the table. "Miss," he said, gesturing toward an empty wine glass. "I believe this needs attention." His tone was polite now, but I noticed several people watching closely. I refilled the glass. "Thank you," he said. Then his gaze drifted once more to my dress. "You know, appearances matter in this world." I nodded. "Sometimes they do." He leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. "People make judgments in seconds." "That's true," I replied. "And sometimes those judgments tell us everything we need to know." A few people at the table exchanged glances. Richard's smile faded for the briefest moment. Then he laughed and turned back to his guests. The evening continued. Orders arrived. Plates disappeared. Dessert was served. Yet I noticed something strange. More than once, important guests entering the restaurant seemed to recognize me. A retired judge greeted me warmly. A prominent business attorney stopped to shake my hand. Each time, I kept the exchanges brief and returned to work. But I caught Richard noticing. Curiosity had replaced amusement in his eyes. Near closing time, I stepped outside for a moment to enjoy the cool spring air. Traffic moved steadily along Fifth Avenue. The city lights shimmered across the glass towers surrounding the park. Behind me, the restaurant buzzed with the final energy of the evening. I heard the door open. Richard had stepped outside as well. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "You seem unusually confident for someone in your position." I smiled again. "And you seem unusually interested in a waitress." For the first time all night, he had no response. I turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing alone beneath the lights of Manhattan. As I disappeared through the doorway, I couldn't help noticing the puzzled expression on his face. That expression should have warned him that the story he thought he understood had only just begun. The next morning began the same way most mornings did for me. I woke up before sunrise in my small apartment on the Upper West Side. The city outside was still quiet, wrapped in the pale blue light that comes just before dawn. I brewed a cup of coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched the streets slowly come alive below. Delivery trucks rolled past. Dog walkers appeared on the sidewalks. Office lights flickered on in distant buildings. It was a simple routine, one I had followed for years, and I valued its predictability. By 7 o'clock, I was already on my way to work. The restaurant would not open for several hours, but there was always preparation to do. Fresh flowers needed arranging. Tables needed setting. Reservations needed reviewing. Most people assumed waitresses only appeared when customers arrived, but they never saw the quiet hours before opening. Those hours belonged to people like me. As I entered through the employee entrance, I noticed my manager, Daniel, standing near the front desk reviewing paperwork. He looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Emily." "Morning, Daniel." He hesitated for a second. "Interesting crowd last night." I smiled slightly. "That is one way to describe it." Daniel laughed. "Richard Harrington does not usually pay attention to staff." Maybe he was bored. "Maybe," Daniel replied, though his expression suggested he was not convinced. The morning passed quickly. Deliveries arrived. Phones rang. Reservations changed. Around noon, the restaurant began filling with customers. Business lunches, tourists, and regular guests occupied nearly every table. I moved through the dining room with the same calm rhythm I always maintained. Orders. Refills. Conversations. Smiles. Most people never remembered the waitress who served them, and that was perfectly fine with me. Just after 1 o'clock, an elderly gentleman entered the restaurant. The hostess greeted him immediately and escorted him to a table near the window. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. Judge Walter Brennan. He had retired several years earlier after one of the most respected legal careers in New York. As I approached his table, his face brightened. "Emily." "Good afternoon, Judge Brennan. It is good to see you again." "Likewise." We exchanged a few polite words before I took his order. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. Yet across the room, I noticed something curious. A man sitting alone at a corner table lowered his newspaper and watched our interaction carefully. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I recognized him. One of Richard Harrington's senior executives. He quickly looked away when our eyes met. Later that afternoon, another familiar face entered the restaurant. Rebecca Lawson, one of the most successful corporate attorneys in Manhattan. The hostess seated her immediately. As I brought water to her table, she stood and warmly shook my hand. "Emily, it has been too long. You have been busy." "Not as busy as you." Her smile carried a meaning that would have confused anyone listening nearby. We spoke briefly before I returned to work. Once again, I noticed people watching. Curiosity was spreading. Questions were forming. By evening, I had almost forgotten about it. Then Daniel approached me near the service station. "You have a visitor." "A visitor?" He nodded toward the entrance. Standing near the front doors was a man wearing an expensive tailored suit. He appeared uncomfortable, as though he did not normally wait for anyone. I immediately recognized him. Richard Harrington's personal assistant. The man stepped forward and offered a polite smile. "Miss Carter, Mr. Harrington would like to invite you to dinner tomorrow evening." I looked at him quietly. Around us, the restaurant continued operating as normal, unaware that several curious employees were listening. "Why?" I asked. The assistant hesitated. "He has questions." I smiled softly. That is exactly what worries him. For the first time, the assistant seemed unsure of what to say. And as he stood there searching for an answer, I realized Richard Harrington had officially stopped laughing. That evening, after the restaurant finally closed, I walked home through streets still glowing with city lights. The invitation from Richard Harrington sat quietly in my mind, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed exactly what I had expected. Men like Richard rarely questioned their first impressions. They preferred certainty. They preferred categories. Successful people. Important people. Ordinary people. The moment someone refused to fit neatly into those categories, curiosity replaced confidence. By the time I reached my apartment, the assistant had already left 2 polite messages, asking for my response. I did not return either call. The next morning arrived with steady rain tapping softly against my windows. I prepared breakfast, reviewed a few notes, and left for work as usual. If anyone expected my routine to change because a billionaire suddenly wanted answers, they would have been disappointed. The restaurant was busy from the moment the doors opened. Tourists escaped the weather. Business meetings filled the dining room. The familiar rhythm of service settled over everything. Around noon, Daniel approached me carrying a small envelope. "This arrived for you." I glanced at the elegant handwriting on the front. No return address. No company logo. Just my name. Inside was a handwritten note. "Miss Carter, I believe first impressions deserve second chances. Dinner tomorrow evening. My assistant will handle every detail. Richard Harrington." I folded the note and slipped it into my apron pocket. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That seems important." "Maybe to him." He laughed. "You are enjoying this far too much." Perhaps I was. Not because Richard was powerful, but because he was experiencing something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed several unusual things. A luxury car parked across the street for nearly 3 hours. 2 men entered separately, ordered coffee, and spent more time observing the dining room than reading their menus. Neither seemed interested in food. Both seemed interested in me. Richard was investigating. The realization made me smile. Unfortunately for him, there was very little to find. Years earlier, I had learned the value of privacy. My social media accounts were practically non-existent. Public records revealed nothing unusual. My apartment was modest. My car was 10 years old. My employment history appeared ordinary. Every path led to the same conclusion. Emily Carter was simply a waitress. Yet that conclusion clearly conflicted with what he kept observing. Late that afternoon, another familiar face entered the restaurant. Thomas Whitaker. One of the most respected philanthropists in New York. His charitable foundation had funded hospitals, schools, and community programs throughout the country. As I approached his table, his expression brightened immediately. "Emily, it is wonderful to see you." "It is good to see you too, Thomas." We spoke briefly. Nothing remarkable. Nothing dramatic. Yet I noticed one of Richard's investigators quietly watching from across the room. More importantly, I noticed his reaction when Thomas stood and warmly shook my hand before leaving. Confusion. Genuine confusion. The pieces refused to fit together. That evening, after my shift ended, Daniel handed me a small package that had arrived at the restaurant. Inside was a simple black invitation card embossed with silver lettering. The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Auction. One of the most exclusive events in Manhattan. Attendance by invitation only. The event was scheduled for the following evening. I studied the card for several seconds. Then I smiled. Everything was unfolding exactly on schedule. Across the city, Richard Harrington was probably still searching for answers hidden inside records, databases, and reports. What he did not understand was that the truth was sitting in plain sight. People often believe status announces itself through expensive watches, designer clothing, and luxury cars. The truly important things rarely do. As I slipped the invitation back into its envelope, I wondered how Richard would react when he walked into the auction the next night. Because for the first time since our paths had crossed, He was about to enter a room where appearances would no longer help him understand who held the real power. The following evening, Manhattan seemed brighter than usual. The city was wrapped in a kind of energy that only appeared during major events. Black cars lined the curb outside the Grand Sterling Hotel. Photographers stood behind velvet ropes. Guests arrived wearing tailored suits, elegant gowns, and expressions carefully polished for public attention. I arrived 20 minutes before the event began. My appearance drew very little attention at first, which was exactly what I expected. The black evening dress I wore was tasteful but understated. No diamonds. No dramatic accessories. No effort to impress strangers. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of points of light across marble floors. Conversations floated through the air. Waiters moved between guests carrying silver trays. Large display screens highlighted charitable projects funded by the foundation. It was one of the most prestigious fundraising events in the city. Richard Harrington stood near the center of the room surrounded by investors and executives. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence he carried. This was his environment. A room filled with influence, wealth, and reputation. As I entered, his attention briefly passed over me before returning to his conversation. Then he looked again. His expression changed immediately. Surprise. Confusion. Curiosity. I offered a polite nod before continuing toward the reception area. Several guests greeted me warmly along the way. Some stopped to shake my hand. Others asked about projects I was involved in. Each interaction seemed to deepen the mystery Richard was trying to solve. I could almost see the questions forming behind his eyes. An hour later, the main program began. Guests moved toward their assigned tables. A stage illuminated the front of the ballroom. The foundation chairman stepped forward and welcomed everyone. He spoke about community initiatives, scholarships, and medical programs supported by the organization. The audience applauded politely throughout the presentation. Then the auction portion of the evening began. One item after another crossed the stage. Artwork. Travel packages. Rare collectibles. Donations climbed higher and higher. Hundreds of thousands of dollars became millions. Richard participated enthusiastically. Several times he won bidding contests against other wealthy attendees. Each victory seemed to restore some of his confidence. Whatever uncertainty he felt about me appeared temporarily forgotten. Then the chairman returned to the microphone. His smile widened. Before we conclude tonight's event, we would like to recognize a contributor whose generosity has transformed countless lives over the past decade. The ballroom quieted. Large screens illuminated behind him. Unlike many donors, she has never sought recognition. She rarely appears in public. She prefers that the work receive attention instead of the person behind it. I noticed Richard casually glance toward the stage. The chairman continued. Tonight, however, we believe it is time to properly thank her. Please join me in welcoming Emily Carter. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then hundreds of faces turned in my direction at once. Richard's expression froze. The confidence that had defined him all evening disappeared instantly. I stood and made my way toward the stage. Applause gradually filled the ballroom. By the time I reached the podium, nearly everyone was standing. I accepted the chairman's handshake and looked out across the audience. Richard remained seated. Not because he was disrespectful. Because he was stunned. The chairman continued speaking. He described hospitals funded through anonymous grants. Educational programs supported in underserved communities. Housing initiatives that had helped thousands of families. Project after project. Donation after donation. The numbers displayed on the screen climbed higher than most people expected. I saw Richard staring at them without blinking. The waitress he had dismissed as insignificant no longer fit any explanation he had prepared. And as the applause echoed through the ballroom once more, I realized he was finally beginning to understand that the story he believed about me had never been true at all. The applause continued long after I stepped away from the podium. People approached from every direction. Some wanted to congratulate me. Others wanted introductions. A few simply wanted to understand how someone they had never heard of had quietly funded projects that changed so many lives. I answered politely, but my attention drifted elsewhere. Across the ballroom, Richard remained standing near his table. The expression on his face was no longer confusion. It was reflection. For the first time since I had met him, he seemed unsure of how to enter a conversation. Throughout his career, people had likely approached him first. They had sought his approval, his attention, his resources. Tonight was different. Eventually, he crossed the room. His movements were slower than usual, as though he were carefully choosing every step. When he reached me, the noise around us seemed to fade. "Emily," he said quietly. It was the first time he had used my name without a trace of amusement. "Richard." He glanced toward the stage where photographs from various charitable projects continued rotating across the screens. Schools. Medical centers. Community programs. Faces of people whose lives had improved because someone had invested in their future. "I owe you an apology." I studied him for a moment. There was no audience now. No investors. No reporters. Just two people standing in a crowded ballroom. "For what?" I asked. He looked surprised by the question. "For making assumptions. For treating you unfairly." I nodded slightly but said nothing. The silence encouraged him to continue. "I spent days trying to figure out who you were. Investigators. Public records. Business contacts. None of it made sense." A faint smile touched my face. "And now?" He exhaled slowly. "Now I realize I was asking the wrong question." That answer interested me. What was the right question? His gaze moved across the room before returning to mine. "Not who you are. Why you chose this life." For the first time that evening, I laughed softly. It was an honest question. A better question. Because it teaches me things I cannot learn from boardrooms. He listened carefully. People show their true character when they believe someone has nothing to offer them. A waitress hears things. Sees things. Learns things. Richard nodded slowly. The idea clearly unsettled him. Nearby, several foundation directors joined our conversation. One of them, Margaret Ellis, had worked with me for years. "Emily refuses every public award we offer her," she said with a smile. "She nearly declined tonight." Richard looked genuinely surprised. "Why?" Margaret laughed. "Because she believes attention should go to the mission, not the donor." Another director joined in. "You should have seen the arguments we had convincing her to attend." Their comments seemed to deepen Richard's understanding. For years, he had operated in a world where visibility often measured success. Public recognition. Magazine covers. Industry rankings. Yet here was someone who had spent years deliberately avoiding all of those things. Later that evening, as guests began leaving, I stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city. Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights sparkled across the skyline. The air felt cooler now. Peaceful. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Richard again. This time he stood beside me without speaking. For nearly a minute, we simply watched the city. Finally, he broke the silence. "There is still something I do not understand." "Only one thing?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Why work at the restaurant at all? You could do anything." I looked out toward the city below. Because I wanted to know whether people value others for who they are or only for what they appear to be. He absorbed the answer quietly. Then his expression changed. A realization. A difficult one. In that moment, he understood that the experiment had never been about wealth. It had been about character. And whether he liked the results or not, he already knew exactly how he had performed. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. I returned to the restaurant, resumed my shifts, and settled back into the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. Customers arrived. Orders were taken. Conversations drifted through the dining room like background music. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. Word about the charity auction had traveled farther than I expected. Several guests recognized me. A few asked questions. Others simply smiled with a newfound respect. I appreciated their kindness, but I never allowed it to alter my routine. The purpose of the experiment had never been recognition. It had always been observation. 3 days after the auction, Daniel handed me a small envelope as I arrived for work. "Another one?" I asked. He laughed. "You seem popular lately." The envelope contained a handwritten note. "Emily, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you again. No business. No audience. Just a conversation. Richard." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Later. That evening, after my shift ended, I found myself sitting across from him at a small cafe several blocks away from the restaurant. There were no photographers. No executives. No luxury dining room. Just 2 cups of coffee and the soft sound of rain against the windows. Richard seemed different. Less certain. More thoughtful. For several minutes, neither of us spoke about the auction. Instead, we discussed ordinary things. The city. Neighborhoods. Books. Community projects. Eventually, he leaned back and looked at me carefully. I have spent most of my life believing I could read people within minutes. I stirred my coffee quietly. And now? He smiled without humor. Now I am questioning how many times I was wrong. The honesty surprised me. Most successful people protected their pride fiercely. Admitting mistakes did not come naturally to them. Richard continued. After the auction, I started thinking about everyone I dismissed over the years. Employees. Service workers. People whose names I never bothered learning. His gaze dropped briefly toward the table. That realization has not been particularly comfortable. I understood. Growth rarely was. The following week, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I noticed Richard entering the restaurant alone. Not as a celebrity businessman surrounded by associates. Not as an important client demanding attention. Simply as a customer. He chose a table near the back and spent nearly an hour there. More importantly, he treated every employee with genuine respect. Hosts. Servers. Bussers. Kitchen staff. He thanked people. Learned names. Asked questions. At first, some employees assumed he was performing for appearances. But there was no audience. No cameras. Nothing to gain. When he left, Daniel approached me. "Is that the same guy?" "Yes." Daniel shook his head. "People can change faster than I thought." Perhaps they could. A month later, I received an invitation to tour one of Richard's corporate offices. Curiosity persuaded me to accept. As we walked through the building together, I noticed something unusual. Employees greeted him comfortably. Conversations seemed more relaxed. The atmosphere felt different from what I had expected. During the tour, Richard stopped beside a newly installed employee recognition board. Hundreds of names filled the display. Receptionists. Maintenance workers. Administrative assistants. People rarely highlight it in corporate presentations. We started this recently, he explained. Recognition should not belong only to executives. I studied the board quietly. It was a small gesture. Yet meaningful changes often began with small gestures. As we continued walking, I realized something important. The greatest surprise had never been my hidden identity. It had been the possibility that someone confronted with their own flaws might actually choose to improve. Most people never do. They become defensive. They make excuses. They protect their ego. Richard had done something rarer. He had listened. And as sunlight poured through the office windows overlooking Manhattan, I began to suspect that the lesson neither of us expected to learn had only just begun. Several weeks passed, and life settled into an unexpected rhythm. The attention surrounding the charity auction gradually faded, replaced by the ordinary routines that most people never notice. At the restaurant, customers came and went. Coffee cups were refilled. Reservations were taken. Conversations floated through the dining room like familiar melodies. Yet beneath the surface, small changes continued unfolding. One afternoon, Daniel called me into his office. "You should see this," he said, sliding a newspaper across his desk. The article featured Richard's company. Normally, that would not have interested me. But the headline was different from the ones I was used to seeing. Instead of celebrating profits or acquisitions, it focused on a new employee development initiative. Scholarships. Education grants. Training programs. Support for workers at every level of the organization. I read the article quietly. "Interesting," I said. Daniel smiled. "You had something to do with this, did you not?" I shook my head. People choose their own direction. But privately, I wondered how much of the change had been influenced by our conversations. A few days later, Richard invited me to attend a community center opening funded jointly by his company and the foundation. The project would provide educational resources, mentorship opportunities, and job training programs for local families. Normally, I avoided public appearances. This time, I accepted. The event took place in Brooklyn on a bright Saturday morning. Families filled the sidewalks. Children ran between activity booths. Volunteers distributed information packets and refreshments. The atmosphere felt hopeful. Genuine. As Richard and I walked through the facility, I noticed something unusual. People approached him comfortably. Not because he was wealthy, but because they believed he cared about the project. He listened carefully to every conversation. Asked questions. Remembered names. The difference from the man I had first encountered at the restaurant was impossible to ignore. At one point, a young student approached us. She could not have been more than 16 years old. "Mr. Harrington," she said nervously, "thank you for the scholarship program." Richard smiled warmly. "You earned it. I never thought college would be possible." For a moment, emotion crossed her face. Then she hurried away to join her friends. Richard watched her go. "That feels different than closing a business deal," he said quietly. "Does it?" I asked. He laughed. "You know it does." Later that afternoon, while guests toured the building, we stepped outside for fresh air. The neighborhood stretched around us beneath a clear blue sky. Children played basketball in a nearby park. Families gathered along the sidewalks. Ordinary moments. Valuable moments. Richard folded his hands and looked toward the community center. I spent years believing success was measured by numbers. Many people do. Now I think I was measuring the wrong things. I remained silent, allowing him to continue. The strange part is that I always considered myself a good person. He shook his head slightly. Then one careless comment revealed something I had never examined. His honesty impressed me. Real growth required more than embarrassment. It required reflection. Most people avoided that process because it was uncomfortable. As the event came to an end, volunteers gathered for photographs. Families thanked donors. Community leaders expressed their appreciation. Yet what stayed with me was not the speeches or recognition. It was the realization that meaningful change often begins with a single moment of discomfort. A single mistake honestly confronted. As the sun started lowering across the Brooklyn skyline, I looked around at the people filling the center. Students. Parents. Volunteers. Employees. None of them knew how this story had started. They only saw the result. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Because sometimes the greatest measure of a person is not who they were when they were wrong. It is who they choose to become after they finally understand why. Autumn arrived quietly in New York. The trees along Central Park shifted from green to shades of gold and amber, and the air carried the crisp edge that signaled another year moving forward. By then, the unusual chapter that had brought Richard and me together seemed almost distant. Life had returned to its normal pace. I still worked shifts at the restaurant. I still lived in the same apartment. I still preferred simple routines over public attention. Yet every now and then, something would remind me how much had changed. One evening, while organizing documents for several foundation projects, I received a call from Margaret Ellis. Her voice carried an excitement that immediately caught my attention. "You need to see this," she said. The next morning, she met me at one of the foundation offices. Spread across a conference table were reports from dozens of organizations that had recently received support. Scholarship programs had expanded. Community centers had opened new locations. Job training initiatives were helping hundreds of people enter stable careers. As I reviewed the documents, I noticed one name appearing repeatedly among the newest contributors. Richard Harrington. Margaret smiled as she watched me read. "He has been busy." That was an understatement. The scale of his involvement surprised even me. He was not simply writing checks. He was attending meetings, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and encouraging other business leaders to participate. More importantly, he was doing much of it quietly. The publicity that once seemed important to him had gradually become secondary to the work itself. Several weeks later, I witnessed something that confirmed the change more clearly than any report ever could. I stopped by one of the community centers without announcing my visit. Inside, students worked on projects while volunteers assisted with tutoring sessions. Near the back of the building, I spotted Richard seated at a table with 3 teenagers discussing college applications. No cameras. No reporters. No executives. Just genuine attention and patience. He listened carefully to every question. Encouraged every concern. Treated each student as though their future truly mattered. I remained unnoticed for several minutes, quietly observing. Finally, one of the students saw me and waved. Richard turned and smiled. "You caught me." "Doing what?" I asked. "Trying to make myself useful." His answer was simple. Honest. The kind of answer he probably would not have given a year earlier. As winter approached, the foundation hosted a small appreciation dinner for volunteers and community partners. Unlike the grand charity auction months earlier, this gathering was modest. There were no elaborate speeches. No luxury ballroom. Just people celebrating meaningful work. Near the end of the evening, Margaret asked me to say a few words. I stood before the room and looked at the faces gathered there. Volunteers. Teachers. Mentors. Donors. Students. Ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things together. My gaze eventually settled on Richard. Then I shared something I had rarely spoken about publicly. I explained why I had spent years working ordinary jobs despite having the resources to live differently. I wanted to understand people when they believed no advantage existed. I wanted to see how strangers treated one another when status disappeared from the equation. The room listened quietly. When I finished, no one applauded immediately. Instead, there was a thoughtful silence. The kind that comes when people are reflecting on something deeper than a speech. And as I looked around the room, I realized the experiment I had started years earlier had revealed far more than I ever expected. Not only about others, but about myself. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries are not hidden in wealth, power, or influence. Sometimes they are found in the simple moments when people are given an opportunity to become better than they were before. Nearly a year had passed since the evening that unexpectedly connected two very different lives. Winter had given way to spring once again, and New York carried the familiar energy of renewal. One morning, I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, casting long reflections across the polished floors. The dining room was still empty. The calm before another busy day. As I arranged fresh flowers on a table near the entrance, Daniel approached carrying a small package. "This came for you," he said. The box was simple, wrapped in plain paper with no indication of who had sent it. Inside was a framed photograph. I immediately recognized the image. It had been taken at the community center opening months earlier. Children stood smiling beside volunteers, teachers, and mentors. In the corner of the photograph, almost unnoticed, Richard was helping a student review a college application. Attached to the frame was a handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching me something success never could." I smiled and carefully placed the photograph beside the flowers. Later that afternoon, the restaurant became unusually busy. Customers filled nearly every seat. Conversations blended together in the comfortable rhythm I had always enjoyed. Around 6 o'clock, I noticed a familiar figure enter through the front doors. Richard. He was alone, just as he often was now. He chose a quiet table near the window and greeted several employees by name before sitting down. Watching him interact with the staff, it was difficult to reconcile this version of him with the man I had first met. Not because he had become perfect. No one does. But because he had become aware. And awareness changes everything. Near the end of my shift, I stopped by his table. "How are the scholarship programs?" I asked. His face brightened immediately. "The latest group starts this summer. More than 300 students. That is wonderful." He nodded. Then he glanced around the restaurant. "Do you ever think about stopping?" "Stopping what?" "The experiment." I considered the question carefully. Outside, evening traffic moved steadily through Manhattan. Inside, servers carried trays between tables while customers shared meals with friends and family. Ordinary moments. Meaningful moments. "No," I said finally. "Because people never stop revealing who they are." Richard smiled. "That sounds exhausting." "Sometimes." He laughed softly. Then his expression grew thoughtful. "You know, for years I believed wealth was the most powerful thing a person could possess." "And now?" I asked. He looked around the room before answering. "Perspective." The answer lingered between us. Simple. Honest. True. As the evening drew to a close, I stepped outside onto the sidewalk. The city lights stretched endlessly in every direction. Somewhere nearby, a taxi horn sounded. Pedestrians hurried past, each carrying their own worries, hopes, and stories. Behind me, the restaurant glowed warmly against the darkness. I thought about everything that had happened. The assumptions. The embarrassment. The discoveries. The unexpected friendship that followed. Most people would probably say the story was about a wealthy man learning a lesson. But standing there beneath the lights of Manhattan, I realized it was really about something much simpler. Every day, people make judgments based on appearances. Clothing. Jobs. Titles. Bank accounts. Yet the things that matter most are often invisible. Character. Kindness. Humility. Integrity. Those cannot be measured by a suit or a dress. They reveal themselves only through actions. I glanced through the restaurant window one final time. Richard was thanking a young server for bringing his coffee. A small gesture. Easy to overlook. Yet sometimes the smallest moments tell the biggest stories. I turned and continued walking down the sidewalk, disappearing into the flow of the city around me. The dress had never mattered. The reaction did. And in the end, that made all the difference.